Hi everyone, and happy Asian Heritage Month. This is the 20th anniversary since the declaration of Asian Heritage Month. My name is Justin Poi. I'm your host of the ImaginASIAN broadcast. I am also the honorary patron of the Canadian Foundation for Asian Culture. This year, we are very happy to celebrate the 20th anniversary. We've got a lot of great events lined up, so be sure to check back to our website frequently. Also, be sure to add our podcast channel to your playlist. We're going to be adding new interviews every 4 to 7 days where I interview an incredible Asian Canadian, somebody who is an epitome, the example of what we can do, making dreams happen, breaking barriers, busting stereotypes, and crashing through the bamboo ceiling, and really forging your own way. Today, I have a very special interview with one of my favorite journalists, Mr. Tony Wong. Tony is a journalist for the Toronto Star. He has written about pretty much everything: business, technology. He's a TV critic. And most famously, he always says that he's a professional TV watcher. Yes, he does get paid to watch TV, but his articles are fantastic. He has interviewed pretty much every Hollywood heavyweight and politician. His interviews are in-depth. They're insightful, and many of his stories are written from his cultural lens, being Jamaican Chinese. I really want to get in depth and find out how culture and heritage have essentially directed people in their lives. This is what Asian Heritage Month is about. So let's listen to that interview now. So, hello, Tony, and thank you very much for doing this interview for Asian Heritage Month. Before I turned the camera on, I was talking about Asians, specifically Asian Canadians, that have careers that don't fall in those typical categories of engineer, doctor, accountant. Tell me a bit about your earliest memories, maybe in childhood, even as what you wanted to do and what you wanted to be.
Yeah, well, I grew up in Montego Bay, Jamaica. If you've ever seen that Steve Martin movie, The Jerk, it's kind of the Asian version of The Jerk, right? Steve Martin's a white guy trying to grow up. And when he does grow up, he thinks he's black. And so basically it's the Asian version of that. But instead of growing up as a banana, which is, yellow outside, white inside, I guess I was, a rotten banana. I guess that's how he did. That's the simplest explanation.
Yeah. That's interesting. So, but now, I've spent a little bit of time getting to know the Jamaican Chinese community, and I grew up with some very good friends who are Jamaican Chinese, and that's sort of a whole very interesting community on its own. But how would you say that your career path ended up being affected or not affected by being Jamaican Chinese and being raised Jamaican Chinese?
Well, what really helped was my brother, my older brother, wanted to be an artist, and he did. He ended up being a successful art director at 17 magazine and in New York. But he started off drawing nude Renaissance portraits, right? So when my mom saw that, she completely freaked out. And so when I said, "Ma, I want to be a writer," she was like, "Thank God, a writer. That's what we need." So I had it easy compared to some folks. It also didn't help that I was probably the only Chinese kid in school who couldn't add. So, I mean, this was a default job. But when I was growing up, certainly I didn't want to be a writer. I wanted to be a comic book artist. I wanted to go to New York and join Marvel and draw comic books. That was sort of my original sort of great aspiration. But when I did arrive in Canada, well, first of all, step back. Jamaica is a British colony. So I went to an Anglican school. So, you were steeped in C.S. Lewis and Tolkien at school. In the streets and just in the community, all my friends were black, so I spoke Jamaican. And at home, I spoke Chinese, which is Hakka Chinese. So really, we were fusion before fusion became sort of a Michelin star kind of deal, right? It was fusion back then was survival food. You throw in some Jamaican food, you throw in some Chinese food, and it's whatever's on the table. That's fusion. So having that kind of disparate kind of upbringing really sort of infused an acceptance of different cultures in me. And of course, always being an outsider, which is helpful for journalism, right? Because in Jamaica, you're always an outsider, physically certainly. And in Canada, when I arrived here, I always felt like a bit of an outsider as well. And even within the Chinese community, because the Hakka is really a minority within a minority, you're also a bit of an outsider. So on all levels, that kind of outsider status is incredibly helpful if you're trying to bridge culture. And I think that's, part of what makes me who I am.
Although you must feel very proud that, the Hakka people have, they have such a strong identity and such amazing, like they have big conferences around the world. And it's interesting where the Hakka people, you see them coming out from all corners, eh? Yeah.
Yeah, it's incredible, and of course you have your Hakka as well. I mean, and your mom is very famously Hakka. I mean, it's so interesting because the Hakka, even though they were a minority, achieved really incredible things politically. Every at one point, most of the major world Asian leaders, as you know, were Hakka, from Deng Xiaoping in China to Cory Aquino in the Philippines to Lee Teng-hui in Taiwan, to, of course, Lee Kuan Yew in Singapore. And this was all at, and this was a minority. And I think that sort of scrappiness is what helped them reach where they were. And in Canada, certainly, you have, Michael Lee Chin and the late Ray Chang. Michael and Ray were, they created large financial services companies, and they were responsible for probably, I mean, in terms of homegrown wealth, in Asian wealth, they were probably the top of the list. So you've got all these role models that you can really work off of.
Yeah, no, and it is interesting. I mean, it's also that you mentioned that scrappiness. I mean, it is in China, the Hakka people, because of their minority, a lot of them left and went all over the world. And, it's very interesting to see how industrious they've been, over history. Yeah. Now, during COVID-19, I want to change gears a little bit. We've bantered online a bit with some common friends about what's going on in the world of Asian perception. Now, how do you understand this phenomenon of Asian hate and what's driving it right now? Because obviously, it's always somewhat existed, to a certain degree, but it's really been brought to the forefront. Tell me your understanding of this, because you have a lot of exposure as a journalist. What do you see is going on right now?
Well, I mean, I think it's, as you were saying, it's always been there. I mean, you just have to go back to the head tax at the turn of the century, where for 4 decades, the Chinese were the only people in Canada who had to pay a head tax, the only ethnic group that was singled out. So, it's a very deep-seated sentiment that just only sort of exploded even further, I think, with COVID, and it didn't help with the rhetoric coming from the US or Donald Trump. So people just came out of the woodwork. It's one of these things that people were given permission to say. And I think it's that coarseness within society that has sort of bubbled to the surface.
Now, this can be very discouraging, obviously, for young people. What would you say to them if they feel really down and discouraged about this? Because, this has all happened while we've been secluded and isolated. There hasn't been an opportunity for mass gatherings and pep talks and stuff like that. So what would be that message? Because a lot of people come to our Asian Heritage Month website, and what would be that message to young people who feel really down just about being Asian right now because of all what's going on right now?
Well, in some ways, I'm actually more hopeful than ever, because there is an attention being paid to this that wasn't being paid before. I think a lot of anti-Asian hate was sort of glossed over the years, and now people are coming out and protesting and actually coming together in a way that I have never seen before. And I think that's so incredible. Now, certainly the internet and social media can be the harbinger of hate, but on the flip side, you can also gather together with like-minded people and do things that you wouldn't be able to do before. You're not alone. So I think I'm actually more hopeful. Obviously there's a lot of crap happening out there, but I'm just so much more hopeful because of the really incredible response that we're seeing out there.
Now, in your own personal experience throughout your career, did you ever feel that you were hindered by being Jamaican Chinese, or did you feel that you got pretty much a fair shake?
Well, when I started at the Star, and I've written about this, it was 1987, and I was the first Chinese or the first Chinese Canadian to be at the Star. And this was 1987, not 1887, right? It wasn't that long ago. It's like insane. And, and when my wife Sharon started at the Toronto Sun, it was, I think, 1991. And she was the first person of Asian descent. So that's pretty, modern history to have that, to take that long when Asians represent 60% of the global population is really astonishing. But when I did start, there's all sorts of microaggressions. But for me, I looked at it as an opportunity to maybe educate even my fellow journalists. For example, people would ask me in the 80s, is it okay to use Oriental? And I'm going, dude, it's like, but they'd ask me stuff like that, right? It was like, man. So it was sort of such a real learning curve. And for example, just last month when Prince Philip died, it just never ends, right? The Sunday Times foreign correspondent, who should know a lot better, wrote a line saying, we all secretly laughed when Prince Philip joked about slitty-eyed Asians. And this is from somebody from the largest British newspaper in the country, who is the foreign correspondent who has traveled all over the world. So if she's thinking that way, what's the average Brexiter thinking? It's frightening, right? That kind of stuff. But, systemic racism is everywhere. And what also was astonishing is that it passed all these copy editors, right? So the definition of systemic
absolutely.
racism, right? Yeah. They didn't see anything wrong with it. Yeah.
Interesting. So, in the in the media world, the portrayal of Asians in media, whether it's fictitious dramas or whether it's in the news media, do you think that that Asians are getting their due now? If it's a historical piece, obviously you have to cast appropriately. But when you look at other roles that could be played by anybody, do you think that Asians are getting their due now if they're being cast and they're up against 10 other people who might be Caucasian for the role of the cop or the hero or whatever? Are they getting their fair share now?
Well, the legacy of Wong Dong from 16 Candles, right? That's a huge hangover, and it's not over yet. I think I've interviewed, as a TV critic, probably most of the Asian stars over the years, and I once asked Ken Jeong, who was starring a new sitcom at the time. Don't you think with your Mr. Chow character that you set back Asian characterization 100 years? And he said, I'm being meta, man. I'm punching so hard through this. They're laughing with me, not at me. And I said, nah, I don't agree, dude. And I think sometimes we do it to ourselves. However, we've come a long way. I think what we've got to do is form our own narrative. For example, Daniel Day Kim, who I talked to last year, did a really great thing. He he quit Hawaii Five-0 and he said, you know, you guys aren't paying me. He quit over pay equity. They wouldn't pay him the same as the White Stars. So he and Grace Park quit Hawaii Five-0 a few years
Oh, okay. So in that role, I mean, you know, he obviously had, you know, he was a star in the show. He clearly had just as many lines as everybody else. How do they justify that? Like, I don't even know how that would, how would you justify to an Asian actor, you're getting paid less than everybody else who's doing exactly the same amount of work as you? How does that get justified?
Exactly. They couldn't justify it. And they quit. You know, and there was a little bit of backlash, but they stuck to their guns, which is, you know, frightening and horrible and horrific all at the same time. But Daniel did get a bit of revenge. What he did was he was watching a Korean drama called The Good Doctor, and he translated that into, he created an English version of The Good Doctor, and it became the #1 drama on TV. He actually went to the network and offered it to them, the Hawaii Five-0 network, and said, hey, you guys want to run this? And they said no. So he took it to ABC, and no, the rest is history. So I think one part of the lesson there is, you know, and it's a difficult part of the lesson because not everybody can do this because Daniel has star power, but he quit. He stuck to his guns. He said, screw this. I'm going to leave a successful TV show and going to create my own stuff. You know, and I think that's a powerful thing. Now, again, that's just one example, but that's a great example.
It's, you know, it's interesting because that story you tell is very similar to what we see everywhere all over the world. You know, when you know, the immigration from Hong Kong came here in the late 80s and 90s, you know, a lot of these Chinese, I met a lot of people who had worked in ad agencies and newspapers and whatnot back in Hong Kong, and their English was fine. They just couldn't get a job here. So they started up their own thing, and some of them ended up doing very well. And, you know, we've seen some very successful companies that are homegrown because it was born out of necessity. It is a little sad, though, to see somebody have to, you know, essentially give up something good, work twice as hard just to get to the same spot as everybody else, right?
Yeah, and it's so frustrating, especially in media. We've had so many false starts, right? When Crazy Rich Asians came on the scene a couple of years ago, everybody went nuts. It was like, oh my God, we finally have a show that represents us. But when you really think about it, it's the most stereotypical show you can ever get, right? It's sort of like Asians are crazy and they're rich.
Yeah, yeah. You know, I mean, yeah, it almost perpetuated all the stereotypes, actually.
Right. Yeah. I mean, imagine if you thought there was this great groundbreaking show coming out that was Crazy Rich Jews, there'd be an uprising, right? But we were so happy to get any kind of representation. The sad part of all this is that it took 25 years for an all Asian cast in Hollywood from the last one, which was the Joy Luck Club, right? So Joy Luck Club was, yes, we did it. We finally made it. We got Joy Luck Club. Now we're part of the mainstream. Never happened. Took 25 years before Crazy Rich Asians, and I hope it doesn't take, you know, another 25 years.
Yeah, I mean, there's just not enough shows where there's Asians cast where the roles they're in are completely independent of them being Asian. There's just not enough of that, you know.
Yeah, and it's really unfair, right? So with Crazy Rich Asians, you've got this weight of cultural expectation, right? That it has to be so good. But why can't we do a mediocre Katherine Heigl rom-com? That is,
yeah, you're right. Yeah,
she can make the same stupid mediocre rom-com all day long. Well, we should be given permission to fail and do crap like that. Yeah. I'm happy to see Asian crap, you know, as long as there's just all kinds of Asian crap, right? And that's the point.
That's a very interesting perspective. Yeah. Now, you know, this is I asked Peter this morning, and I speak to politicians about this all the time. You know, when they are, they very often get elected, or, you know, they make their mark because of the constituency they're in. But then once you're in, you have to represent all Canadians. And there's always that balance, you know, like, okay, I am Chinese or I am Indian and I have to represent but I'm also, you know, I'm a actual like full Canadian politician. Now, for yourself, when you are writing, how much of that balance is, you know, I'm writing as somebody from my background as Jamaican Chinese, or I'm writing as just a Canadian journalist, just like every other journalist? How do you balance that?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question, right? I mean, there's that myth of journalistic objectivity, right? It's sort of, what can I really cover race relations in Scarborough about people complaining about, too many Asian malls being built if I'm Chinese, is the really only the real only true objectivity coming from, a white Canadian. And that is the myth of kind of objectivity. Why can't we also write about these things? It's really silly. And in fact, well, actually, as a columnist, I can write about anything I want. But I did, when I first started as a TV columnist, somebody who shall remain unnamed once said, why are you writing so much Asian stuff? I'm going, dude, listen, if John Doyle, the great John Doyle over at the Globe, who's also a TV critic, can write all day about him being Irish, I'm going to write anything I want about being Asian because that's what I know. Yeah. So, I think it's silly, especially within a media context, to deny who you are. Mm-hmm. I mean, it's but that is a great question.
So you never. So you
I'm wearing I'm just honored to be Asian T-shirt. my Sandra Oh T-shirt. Yeah. So, I mean,
you never felt that pressure, Tony, to go almost the other way and not talk about Asian issues or anything? You never felt that pressure just because you didn't want your readers to think, oh, okay, I'm the Chinese writer,
Well, I was lucky in the sense that I did just a whole bunch of stuff that had nothing to do with being Asian at the beginning, right? So it was, I covered politics at City Hall, Queen's Park, business, sports, crime, and then television. So I didn't really have that pressure, although there were moments where I was the only one who could do the story. So, for example, when I covered crime, I spent a month undercover. There were these mass shootings in Chinatown in the early 90s. And anyway, long story short, I ended up being a casket bearer for the most notorious Vietnamese gangster in as an undercover. I was undercover at the time, but obviously, nobody else could have done that job.
Yeah. Right. That's really interesting. So, what would you say, looking back at your career? Obviously, you're still going strong, but what are some of the, think of maybe one of the highlights that you'd want to share with, that would resonate with young Asians in Canada?
Wow, I don't know if I have any highlights. Oh my God.
Oh, you must have time.
Geez. Well, if I were to tell young reporters is that you can have an influence, right? I mean, especially, if I'm coming from a media point of view, our social activism, Chinese Canadian social activism, came about because of wrongful portrayal in the media, right? So over 40 years ago, as you know, I know, W5, which is CTV's largest, investigative journal, did a piece called Campus Giveaway. They went to U of T, showed dental and pharmacy students and saying, look, regular Canadians can't get into school, professional schools, because they're, all these foreigners are taking away our spots. Well, those foreigners, and a couple of them happen to be friends, were actually Chinese and Asian Canadians and Korean Canadians and Japanese Canadians. So it was, there were mass protests over this. And it was the first time that we had this kind of social activism in Canada to that extent, which formed the Chinese Canadian National Council. So that's how much of an impact media has had on who we are as Asians.
Are we vocal enough as Chinese Canadians? Are we organized enough?
I really don't think so. And in one of my columns, I said, "Where's our Asian Black Panthers? Yeah. We need to raise a little more hell, right?" It's really tough, right? Because and from our, certainly my parents, the nail that sticks out gets hammered down. So you just shut your trap and move on. And it's not just our parents, but it's such an deeply inbred thought. I wrote a column because I was so angry one time at Andrew Yang for saying that to be more American, we should all pitch in and, wave the flag and contribute to your society. which is all good, but we shouldn't have to wave the flag and wrap ourselves in the flag just so we don't get punched in the head by the KKK, right? I mean, it's insane. We don't have to ingratiate ourselves so we don't get assaulted. And to a certain extent, that's what he was saying. And I love Andrew Chang, but, you know, yeah.
Now, the Olympics are coming, and there have been Olympics before hosted in China. When you're watching the Olympics, China, Canada, Jamaica, who do you root for, or do you root for all of them, or how do you separate your not loyalty, but sort of that pride?
God, you know what? I do root for all of them because, but at the end of the day, I'm Canadian, and because Canada, I'm not saying this for any cheap political points, but Canada is really the only society that I could have seen that would value my Jamaicanness, would value my Asianness, and allow me to be all these things, right? They're you know, they're together. They're actually the sum becomes you know, greater than the parts, right? And Canada allowed me to do that. I think it's one of the very few societies that that makes you coalesce all these things, and I think it's so much different than the multiculturalism versus, you know, melting pot theory, and it works. It really works.
Yeah, great. So it sounds like, I mean, I guess what would that message be, you know, to young Asians right now? You know, some of them feeling very bit down and discouraged about what's going on with, you know, anti-Asian hate and whatnot. What's that encouraging message you would give to them for this Asian Heritage Month?
Well, yeah, for sure. I'd say, you know, you're not alone. And I think, you know, given that there's so much more social media savvy than ever before, you can organize, you can come together, you can have a voice. And also we need, you know, you're the hope, right? Because we need more voices in media. We need more voices in politics. We need more voices in business in order to have, you know, that complete kind of representation.
That's great. Thank you very much, Tony, for your time. This has been awesome, and happy Asian Heritage Month.
Happy Asian Heritage Month, and shout out to you and you know, especially your mom, because we wouldn't be having this conversation if not for your mom. And that's a great example of having representation in politics, right? If not for her, we wouldn't be here.
Hey, thanks for joining us today for the ImaginASIAN broadcast. Remember, we're celebrating the 20th anniversary of Asian Heritage Month, so don't forget to check back frequently on our website. We got lots of great stuff coming up. And at our YouTube channel, many more interviews to come. My name is Justin Poi. We'll see you next time.